I wasn't going to look at this. It's not fresh anymore and I was just going to leave it. But then I saw a bunch of people saying how spot on it is, and that it's been shared thousands of times, so fuck it. Let's have some fun and go on some tangents. It might be meant as a wind-up piece, but it's still a good springboard for discussion. Gamers have become the new religious right by Jeff Rauner. There's a link to the full article in the description box, and I recommend reading it in its entirety. It's a real blast. According to Jeff, gamers, specifically right-wing reactionary gamers, have become the new religious right, looking to blast art they don't like from the face of the earth. And what does he present as evidence? The closest I could find is an assertion. Regarding critics who like novelty indie games, he claims that the problem is that now there is a whole community of gamers dedicated to hating absolutely anything that these critics enjoy, and they often go on dedicated harassment campaigns to try and shut down the games or drive them away. Sounds scary. Where are these harassers conspiring? Who exactly are they? How does he know that's who they are, and that's their aim as a collective? He's made a very precise claim, and you should expect it to be strongly supported by evidence. I'd expect questions like these to be answered if what he's claiming is true, because if they're not answered, or if he can't answer them, how certain can he be about what he's throwing out there under this baity headline? Let's see what Jeff gives us. His latest example of this happening is some people raging about That Dragon Cancer on Steam's forums, accusing it of being exploitative, for example. According to Jeff, this happened because a certain critic covered it. He writes, "Feminist Frequency gave the game a good review, and so of course the horde has descended on Steam to flood the forums with cries of field marketing, and saying the Green's immoral for not donating profits to cancer research. But while there certainly are people saying that, I'm not seeing any evidence of the cause and effect relationship or organization he's suggesting." At the time of writing, the Feminist Frequency review is sitting at just over 30,000 views, which would be very nice for me, but quite poor for their channel. And it wasn't reviewed by Anita. Instead, Caroline Petty took this task on. Who? Exactly. I'm finding it hard to believe anyone would care enough to put a harassment campaign together against a game she likes, or mobilize a community of gamers dedicated to that. How the hell does he know they're right-wing reactionaries either? I don't want to have to just brush away these assertions about a community trying to blast art from the face of the earth, but it looks like I have to. Further evidence presented is some guy saying he's wary of a game because of who gave it an award and issues they've been involved with. A person criticizing Life is Strange on some kind of MRA forum, and someone asking Tim Schafer a question in his Ask Me Anything thread on Reddit. Looking through what Jeff linked, this all seems fine to me. I mean, I'm fine with trolling, but what I mean is, to my disappointment, that's not really going on there. Personally, I'm not into apologies for jokes, whether they're an attack or not. But like I said, taking a look at it, I don't think these people are trolls. Jeff presents this in his piece as trolls trying to shut down any real conversation. I'd love to talk to him about this for clarification of what he's trying to say in case I've misunderstood. Have some of that conversation thing he says folks are so keen on shutting down. But, of course, I'm blocked, and I'm happy to respect his request that I not contact him. On top of all this, his choice of spotlighting That Dragon Cancer is hilarious. If you read the article, you'll see him talk about these niche games and their ability to break away from the status quo, how the gamer right, as he calls it, is angry because they want games to bolster traditional values and not deviate from gaming norms. Here's a clip from That Dragon Cancer.
And we know that God can win even if Joel can't. That's grace.
Yeah. Primarily, the game is a sort of first-person point-and-click, so I'd personally call it traditional overall anyway, but the couple of alternative gameplay sections are what you've just seen, and shitty kart racing. All aboard the Keymobile! You may have also noticed the religious aspect. In fact, the highest rated Steam review that doesn't recommend the game points to the amount of religion in the game as what put them off, and I can confirm that there is a lot of it.
We pray with all the strength, with all the faith that is in us, Lord.
There's a story in the Bible where Jesus and his disciples are on a boat.
I have so many things stirring around in my spirit that I have to write to settle myself and find God's wisdom in the midst of chaos.
Jeff speaks of mainstream gaming as being dominated by Christian American norms, and speaks of indie development as being free from the massive sales expectations of AAA gaming, and therefore less beholden to the status quo. These games are often the ones that social critics applaud. They take chances on main characters being non-white or female or gay. They play with subverting tropes instead of relying on them. But just wait until this guy gets his paycheck and plays this fucking game, as he says he will. Holy shit. Yeah, this niche title contrasts with your average AAA game, but in the opposite direction of what we're being told little games and distribution allow for. I think this would be one of the gamer right's favourite games. Regarding other games he's mentioned, Gone Home, Life is Strange and Undertale, my personal experience is mostly of gamers defending them to me, actually. To me, Gone Home and Life is Strange are extremely old-fashioned in what they do as games. Maybe seeming new in the way that a little kid will find a Walkman to be new and alien, even after using something more advanced. I remember Gone Home trying to rely heavily on nostalgia even. I do see them being hated a fair bit. And there are people saying this isn't a game or whatever, but they're not some organised mob, and there are other reasons Gone Home got lots of hate too. And Undertale, that does do a few cool things and I liked it. Again, I'm not seeing this capital G gamer gang organising to hate it, and he doesn't present anything either, so I don't know what the point of mentioning them in the context of this article was. It's hard to criticise what he said because I don't know and can't find who he's fucking talking about. Does he just mean anyone who hates these games? I can't even say, no, they're not like that, or yeah, he's got a point about them, because it's unclear who they are. Is there anyone with a platform pushing this approach to games, or is it just random posters and anyone who might agree with them somewhere on the internet? So looking at his claims about this community he mentions trying to blast art away, and why they do it, I'm left only able to say that he's written nonsense. Now let's look at some other bits and pieces of this article. His setup is all about the religious right, and how there was Jack Thompson claiming games cause violence, yada yada. But how now, in the US, games are protected under the First Amendment as a distinct communications medium. His suggestion being that we shouldn't worry about discussion of what games can cause, because that protection's there. Carrying on from his introduction, he wrote, journalists like Lee Alexander and Matty Bryce, as well as YouTubers like Anita Sarkeesian, began looking at game content, both narrative and mechanical, and examining what that content said about us. It was not, as a lot of gamers like to claim, a call to censor or ban that content. It was just looking at it in a more thoughtful and nuanced way. With games now protected by all the power of the First Amendment, you would think that discussion over them could flourish more freely, since they were in no danger of being taken away. He then continues to talk about 4chan ops and Gamergate silencing these critics, flagging Anita's videos, carrying out distributed denial of service attacks on sites, or discrediting poor journalists and making them fear for their jobs. Though still not really telling me anything about who did it, the actual people and their motivations, or at least nothing that's backed up. He's just given us boogeymen, more of an out-group than a group. Maybe you can compare some of these things to the protests he mentions at the start, but his description of who's doing all this just doesn't work. He's written us a ghost story. If we are going to talk about this kind of thing though, and Anita in particular, it brings me right back to 2012. I think that's when I heard about her, and I think I heard about her through a game. Beat Up Anita Sarkeesian. Well, I remember it being called a game at least. Sarkeesian, whose face featured in the game as something to punch, as you can currently see, called it interactive assault harassment. In another statement regarding the game, she wrote, "It's important that individuals who engage in hateful behavior and threats of violence don't go unchallenged, and do face some measure of accountability. That said, it's also critical to remember that the domestic violence game targeting me is a symptom of our deeply misogynist culture, both online and offline. In far too many online and gaming spaces, sexist behavior is still unfortunately considered normal, acceptable, or expected. This particular domestic violence game is just one of the more extreme manifestations of the sustained cybermob-style harassment campaign directed at me, which has been perpetrated by hundreds, if not thousands, of mostly anonymous internet users over the course of several weeks. Why is this old thing relevant? In wider debate about free speech or expression, the current play or trick to getting rid of something you don't like is to try pushing it outside of what counts as protected speech. It's not free speech, it's hate speech. It's not criticism, it's harassment. Or here, it's not a game, it's harassment. This is an extreme and unique example that can be argued over, and it's probably in part for that reason that it came to mind. Censorial approaches needn't include an explicit call for censorship or banning. That would make it very easy to deal with, if you wanted to make it that black and white, but it isn't really that way. It's a massive topic. It's a really hard topic, and it's a topic many people have many different views on. An argument, video, article, a collection of these can have independent elements that cross a line into censorial territory to a greater or lesser degree. What is considered justified varies a great deal too. While I would try to define creative work or art and expression as broadly as possible, and what should be limited or considered unacceptable as narrowly as possible, others might consider something that sloppily shows someone's face getting slammed to cross a line from pure expression to being a threat or harassment. Should harassment be tolerated? The line I draw is much further along, and would be crossed by something more like a game that, I don't know, releases someone's stolen credit card details. Now let's take a grayer, more recent example of what a critic has said. Regarding brutal, nasty games, Extra Credit wrote, "There's no value in sadistic games like hatred. These games revel in the pain we cause to others, crossing the line from violence to cruelty. These games have every right to be made, and calls for a ban would be misdirected, but they have no right to be rewarded for exploiting cruelty to create sensation. Do not buy them. Do not glorify them. Do not mistake sadism for expression." Here, they explicitly say these games should be allowed, but they also demand that people not buy them, apparently on moral grounds. And they suggest that they do not count as expression, but rather something else that is purely exploitative and sadistic. Just a touch censorial? I think so, and in a way that I personally oppose. Some people feel similarly about other things. Take, for example, Jeff using people discrediting journalists as an example of the first way that gamers became the new apostles in the church of censorship. The mass flagging of videos and distributed denial of service attacks he points at, regardless of who's doing it and whether they're the gamer right or not, I think most will agree are censorial and also unjustified. But discrediting journalists, when I seize upon something a journalist's done and try to nail them for it to an audience, absolutely with the intent of harming their reputation and affecting how much trust they're listened to with, or how much they're listened to at all, for the good of what teeny little tiny bit of the public I can reach, is that just me mimicking the tactics of the religious right? Could you argue that an approach like this has a censorial tinge to it? Yeah, you could. I'm often saying certain examples of media shouldn't be trusted and can cause harm through mass distribution. I push for correction of factual inaccuracy in reporting and for corrections to be clearly noted, and I think that's quite easy to justify. Jeff might disagree, as that could hurt a journalist's reputation. It could potentially contribute to discrediting them, which is supposedly a silencing tactic. Let's try another blurry example. Lee Alexander was one of the people Jeff named. Just a few days ago, she wrote an article for The Guardian about Stolen. I didn't get an opportunity to try it before it was shut down, but from what I've seen, the basic premise is that Twitter profile pics are turned into digital trading cards, and then used in this game to be bought with fictional currency and swapped. Lee described this as a privacy minefield, and called what the app does a new kind of digital violation. which interested me immediately. I'm very critical of things such as EULAs that I find unreasonable, developers breaking promises to paying customers, issues that relate to agreements or actions outside of a creation. So a game that invades privacy is going to catch my eye. That sounds like it's in the territory of what I might be convinced should be fought against and beaten out. Now, to be completely fair, Lee's article does lightly brush against, but not quite directly address, the kind of problem I had in mind once or twice, including in the closing paragraph where she, poetically writes of platform holders and app developers hungry to build their business opportunities on our aggregate cries out into the universe. However, for this video I'm going to pick out one particular point, the one I think is most important. In her article, she presents the game as a danger to women in particular, writing, "For lots of women who are public speakers, writers, or outspoken voices in technology, constant grief from trollish or abusive Twitter users is already an anxiety-inducing fact of life, even without the ability for stalkers, haters, and creeps to own you." An example is given of a woman being sent a screen capture of her profile picture with some writing on it, and how that was a disquieting experience for her. So perhaps we should ban the download of images and Microsoft Paint. Anyway, this characterization of the game as some kind of harassment tool was also reinforced by United States Congresswoman Katherine Clark, who called it an app that enables online abusers to own people's profiles. Attached to her tweet was an image of the letters she sent to Apple and Twitter, which again included concerns about the safety of women, and this time people of color too. She wrote, "My concern is that given the widespread harassment that already occurs on your platform, particularly harassment targeting women and people of color, the Stolen application will only provide another tool to harass, bully, and intimidate. Imagine the implications of this application for the domestic violence survivor who receives a notification that their former abuser now owns them, or the cyber abuse activist who is purchased by the person whose violent threats have forced them from their home." While I appreciate that this application was not developed as a tool for internet harassment, it will be used as one if it continues to receive access to profiles of individuals who have not agreed to participate. I urge you to immediately suspend Stolen's access to Twitter until non-consenting profiles are removed, and safeguards are implemented that ensure that no Twitter profile may be used by the application without clear, express consent. Under this combined pressure from press, including sensitive, thoughtful game critic Lee Alexander, and a congresswoman, and a mass of concerned people looking to opt out following negative coverage, the app was shut down by its owner and the whole project apparently cancelled. On their Twitter page, they pointed customers to where they could get refunds for anything they'd spent. Speaking to Casey Newton, who wrote about this for TheVerge.com, the founder of Hey, creators of Stolen, said the decision was made to stop the harm, real and perceived, that people are getting from the existence of their product. He also said they didn't spend hours and months, sweat and tears to build something like this and have people see it this way. The answer, if you want to look at why Stolen was scrapped, isn't just to stop harm, is it? It's clear to me that a number of things fed into this outcome. Looking around the web, there was some of what I'd consider perfectly reasonable criticism. Some manipulation, some exaggeration, some speculation, and some misrepresentation. A politician brought their status into play, even if it can be argued that there are legitimate privacy concerns significant enough to justify this app being shut down on the basis that it's harmful. I don't believe that's the primary reason for it having been shut down. If I'm correct, that's a problem. I don't think there being fair concerns means any approach to shut down the offending creation is then acceptable. It's a confusing, tangled problem smeared in shades of grey, but a problem nonetheless. One that I'm not going to continue wrestling with here, but one I hope has demonstrated what I said earlier. If you want something gone, you should work on convincing people that it causes, leads to, or could lead to harm. Helps if you got a little grain of something legit against it, but from there just go wild. And that applies to creative content within games too, though you will find that the approach is almost always more subtle. Earlier in this video, I showed you an example of a game being called harassment, That's on the extreme end of making a case for a creation being harmful or causing harm, but culture critics often make arguments that I'd argue fall on that scale, just lower down than claiming harassment. Yes, they have their little nuggets of info or a couple sources, but when making claims about what games cause, they'll happily jump outside the bounds of what they've got support for. Jeff shares, in his article about the gamer right, a couple examples of research on the effect of games. He suggests that the problem people have with this cultural criticism is simply that people don't like these scientifically supported ideas being discussed because they represent a challenge to the status quo. He writes, "At the heart of the movement to shut down game critique is an appeal to tradition and purity, discussing how sexualized avatars contribute to the objectification of women in the real world, or how playing games with sexist content makes sexist behavior more likely, gets framed as an attack. Similar to how women entering the workplace in greater numbers in the 1980s was often framed as an attack on the traditional gender roles celebrated in the Bible." Does it? Is that what gets framed as an attack? I can only speak for myself, but what I see as an attack is unsubstantiated claims of what I'd call harm. For example, when I watched Women as Reward by Feminist Frequency with some shitlords, this bit stuck with me. Regarding the ideology of male entitlement, as allegedly reinforced and cemented into men's minds by video games, they wrote, "And it's not just men who are affected. This ideology of male entitlement seeps into the wider social consciousness of everyone, regardless of gender, a byproduct of which can negatively impact the ways women relate to one another and the ways we think about our relationships to our own bodies and our own sexuality." Holy shit. Video games fuck women up. Every time my eyes run past it writing this script, god damn. Could it possibly be that assertions like that annoy people, and that's part of people hating them? If it's true, okay, but there's never a whole lot there to convince me statements like this are true. They sure sound bad though, and they sound even worse when you read on Feminist Frequency's website that these videos widely serve as educational tools in high school and university classrooms. Well, that example obviously isn't an explicit call for censorship, and you'll be hard-pressed to find one. I think it's totally fucking fair to say the approach of a bunch of these guys, these culture critics, is censorial. I mean, they're doing the parts of a censor's job where they identify what's morally unsuitable or too harmful for, safe public consumption, and come up with changes. The aim being to convince people that this is the way to go for a greater social good. Let's say everyone making claims regarding the negative real-life effects games have, or the negative effects they can contribute to, is right. You can approach and discuss that from other angles than the need for things to change as a result of this information. If games cause things, this should be analysed and understood. But I'd push the argument that the point at which that becomes a reason to enact or pressure for change should be as extreme as possible. That it should come at the point a game's effect is clear and massive, and not, for example, based on some weird hipster's interpretation and the pain it causes them because they're a woman or minority. Trying to effect change for a greater good on anything less than solid evidence doesn't wash with me, especially when it comes to creative work. If people want something creative made a certain way, or would prefer something that exists already to be different, because that's just what they'd like, great, argue for that. Explain why. That's all cool with me. Credit where it's due, the latest Tropes vs. Women is a little bit better. The whole "no one can respect a slut, so cover up that big fat butt" deal is more Islamic amplitude than Feminist Frequency. Paraphrasing, of course. But the series is going more in the direction of opinion vlog than teaching tool. Soon, I'm sure they'll have their very own offshoot site on Boing Boing. No, it's not suggestion of change or discussion that really irks me, or irks me at all. It's when negative effect, discrimination, exclusion, racism, sexism, any of these things are wielded to say creation should change, to stop harm or damage on some level, coming from art and other creative work. That's a line crossed for me, unless perhaps the effect is huge and evidence for that huge effect is overwhelming. But before I wander too far down this winding road of a tangent and explain where all my lines are and why, I'm going to try wrapping this up. Splitting debate over censorship and free expression by left, right, whatever, doesn't work in a wider discussion of the issue, and it doesn't work when you narrow the scope down to video games and video game culture either. It really doesn't work if you're going to try splitting it into culture critics and random fucks on the internet. Perhaps socially aware critics with platforms and positive coverage from Games Press who have starkly different views from his examples would receive abuse, takedown attempts, DDoS attacks on their sites and so on, if there fucking were any. Now there is an uneven status quo to be challenged, but it's the status quo of Games Press and so won't be. Increasingly, games, gaming, and gamers are being recognized for their political value. I'm sure you must have noticed. This means gaming culture and the discussion around gaming is going to face a massive influx of bullshit. Bullshit from people who are fighting a kind of war. People who understand that prioritizing or even supporting free expression at all as any kind of universal ideal will hurt their ability to win this fight they're in. It's not a good move strategically to let your opponent speak freely, or to let yourself and others listen to them if you can help it. There is, of course, also a more general statement to be made about people being all for unfettered expression when it agrees with them or doesn't upset them, or when they don't think it will cause something they're afraid of. The fear of large amounts of people being exposed to certain ideas that Jeff outlines in his piece as the motivation to silence critics or to crush games exists. But it can exist anywhere, and trying to pin it on one group like the gamer right that feels and acts on it, in contrast with your team that doesn't and wouldn't, will do little beyond helping you to develop a blind spot for when your allies are at fault. It's an approach that incentivizes oversimplification of a vast and complex issue into a club to bludgeon opponents with, which can also be done by anyone. Jeff ends his piece with the line, "The religious right fought to keep sex and murder from interactive media, and their ideological successors are fighting to keep thought out of it with the same unquestioning zealousness." And you know what? I think he's right. But, as usual, that's just another one of my harmful opinions. One last thing. JDMew, JADEYMEW, on Twitter, drew this for me. It's got just loads of bits and pieces from all the different games I've been streaming. Fucking brilliant. Thank you.